If you take that, you won't wake up, the girl said quietly, and for a split second, time seemed to stall inside the private hospital suite as William Carter, a man used to making billion-dollar decisions without hesitation, froze with a single white pill hovering just inches from his lips, his fingers tightening ever so slightly before he slowly lowered his hand, his eyes shifting toward the small figure standing near the doorway. A girl no older than 10, her posture still but her gaze unshaken, as if she understood the weight of what she had just said. And across the room, Dr. Robert Hayes paused mid-step, his professional composure slipping for just a fraction of a second too long to go unnoticed, a subtle hesitation that someone less observant might have missed. But William did not build his empire by ignoring details, especially not moments like that, moments that did not make sense, moments that lingered just a beat longer than they should. And suddenly, the past few weeks began to replay in his mind. The unexplained fatigue, the mild but persistent headaches, the way his body had felt just slightly off despite the clean reports and confident reassurances, and now, standing here in a room filled with polished surfaces and quiet machines, that single sentence from a child cut through everything, sharp and undeniable, as if it belonged to a truth no one else wanted to acknowledge. And yet the logical part of his mind resisted, because this was a controlled environment, one of the most reputable medical facilities in the country, staffed by specialists he personally selected, overseen by protocols designed to eliminate error. So how could a child, a visitor with no credentials, no authority, disrupt that certainty with just a few words? And still, something about her tone did not sound like a guess. It sounded like a warning, and William slowly turned his body toward her, lowering the pill completely now, his voice calm but edged with curiosity as he asked her what she meant, and the girl, Ava, did not step back or look away. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly and pointed toward the small bottle resting on the bedside table, her finger steady as she said. It did not look the same as yesterday, and for the first time, William followed her gaze not as a patient trusting his care, but as a man examining a potential problem, his eyes narrowing just enough to notice details he had overlooked before, the label slightly misaligned, the cap a shade different under the light, details so small they could be dismissed, yet now impossible to ignore. And behind him, Dr. Hayes cleared his throat, stepping forward with a practiced smile, beginning to explain that everything was exactly as prescribed, that variations in packaging were normal, that there was no cause for concern, his voice smooth, controlled, almost too controlled, and William listened. But this time, he was not reassured, because the room had already shifted, the balance had already changed, and the certainty he once felt was now replaced with a quiet, growing doubt that refused to be silenced. And as he looked back at Ava, who remained still, watching, waiting, it became clear that whatever was about to happen next would not follow the script he had been given. And for the first time since entering that room, William Carter did not feel in control. William did not pick the pill back up. Instead, he walked slowly toward the bedside table, each step measured, his eyes fixed on the small orange bottle, as if it had suddenly become the most important object in the room. And when he reached it, he did not touch it right away. He simply leaned in slightly, studying it with the same attention he once used to read contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Noticing how the label sat just a fraction of an inch off center, how the printed text looked slightly bolder than it should, how the cap did not quite match the others he remembered seeing over the past week. And behind him, Dr. Hayes continued speaking in a calm, controlled tone, explaining manufacturing variations, supply chain differences, routine substitutions that were fully approved and completely safe. But William did not turn around, because the explanation sounded correct, yet it did not feel right. And that difference, that subtle disconnect, was something he had learned never to ignore. And then he reached out and picked up the bottle, turning it slowly in his hand, his thumb brushing across the label as if he expected it to reveal something hidden beneath the surface. And in that moment, Ava took a small step closer, her voice softer now, but steady as she said that yesterday the number on the label ended with a 3, and now it ended with a 7, and that the color of the pills looked a little lighter, not by much, but enough that she noticed when she saw the nurse switch them earlier in the storage room. And that detail landed differently, because it was specific, not a guess, not a feeling, but an observation, and William's grip tightened slightly around the bottle as he finally turned his head to look at Dr. Hayes. His expression calm, but his eyes sharp, asking a simple question about the batch number and whether it had been changed since the previous day. And for a brief second, just a brief second, the doctor hesitated before answering, and that hesitation echoed louder than any words that followed, because it broke the rhythm. It disrupted the confidence that had been carefully maintained, and William did not interrupt. He let the explanation continue, but now he was listening differently, weighing each word, comparing each detail. And across the room, a nurse shifted her weight, her hands clasped a little tighter than before, her gaze flickering between the doctor and the bottle in William's hand. And the air in the room grew heavier, not with panic, but with something quieter and more dangerous, uncertainty. And William set the bottle back down with deliberate care, aligning it exactly where it had been, as if marking its position in his mind. And then he spoke again, his voice low and even, asking for the medication log from the past 48 hours, asking for the exact time each dose had been prepared and delivered, asking for the names of everyone who had handled it. And this time, the request was not a suggestion, it was a decision. And as the room fell into a brief, tense silence, Ava remained where she was, watching, not surprised, not afraid, as if she had already known that this moment would come. And William Carter, who had built his life on control and precision, now stood in a place where both had been quietly challenged, and he was no longer willing to ignore it. The silence did not last long, but it stretched just enough to expose what words could not hide. And William remained standing beside the table, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably firm, as if he had already moved past doubt and into verification, while Dr. Hayes reached for his tablet with a controlled motion, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he began pulling up the medication records, explaining that everything was logged digitally, time-stamped, double-checked, that there would be nothing out of place, his tone steady but slightly tighter than before. And William listened without interrupting, his gaze shifting briefly toward the nurse who had stepped back closer to the wall, her shoulders subtly tense, her attention no longer neutral but cautious. And then the tablet was turned toward him, displaying rows of entries, precise times, initials, batch numbers, all aligned in a way that suggested order. But William did not scan it like a patient seeking reassurance. He studied it like a problem waiting to reveal itself, tracing the entries with his eyes, noticing how the timing of the last dose was exactly 12 hours apart from the previous one, consistent, predictable, almost too perfect. And then he asked a simple question: why the batch number changed overnight without a corresponding note? And Dr. Hayes responded immediately, saying it was a routine restock, that supplies were rotated to ensure freshness, that nothing unusual had occurred. But William did not look at the doctor when he answered. He looked at the timestamps again, calculating quietly, because the restock would have required documentation, a delivery log, a chain of custody, and yet none of that appeared on the screen in front of him. And Ava, still standing near the doorway, spoke again, her voice low but clear as she said she saw the bottle before sunrise, when the hallway was empty and the lights were dim, and she remembered it because the nurse had looked over her shoulder more than once, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. And that detail shifted the room again, not dramatically, but enough to break the fragile sense of normalcy that remained. And William finally looked up from the tablet, his expression calm, but now unmistakably decisive, as he asked for the security footage from the storage room during that time frame, not raising his voice, not accusing, simply requesting in a way that assumed compliance. And Dr. Hayes hesitated again, just for a moment, before saying that access to that system required administrative clearance, that it would take time, that procedures had to be followed. And William nodded slightly, as if accepting the explanation, but then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing a number without looking away from the doctor, his tone even as he spoke to someone on the other end, asking for immediate access to all internal surveillance within the facility, his authority clear without needing to be stated. And as he ended the call, the atmosphere shifted. Once more, this time with a quiet finality, because the situation was no longer contained within explanations and reassurances. It had moved into verification, into evidence, into something that could not be adjusted with words alone. and as the seconds passed, the faint hum of the room seemed louder than before, each sound sharper, each movement more noticeable, and Ava remained still, her eyes moving briefly to the tablet, then to the bottle, then back to William, as if she was following a sequence she had already seen in her mind. And William Carter, standing in the center of it all, was no longer questioning whether something was wrong. He was now waiting to see how deep it went. Minutes did not pass so much as they stretched, each second pulling tighter against the quiet pressure building inside the room. And William stood near the table with the same composed stillness, his attention fixed not on any one person but on the space between them, where truth would either surface or collapse under its own weight. And across from him, Dr. Hayes adjusted his stance slightly, his shoulders squared, his expression carefully neutral, as if maintaining control through posture. Alone, while the nurse near the wall shifted again, her eyes lowering briefly before returning to the tablet in the doctor's hand. And then William's phone vibrated once, a small sound that carried far more significance than its volume suggested. And he glanced down just long enough to read the message before locking the screen again, his face unchanged. But something in the air responded, as if the room itself understood that the next step had already begun. And he spoke without raising his voice, informing Dr. Hayes that access had been granted and that the footage from the storage room would be pulled immediately, that there would be no delay, no procedural barrier, just a direct look at what had happened. And for the first time, the doctor did not respond right away, his lips parting slightly before closing again, his eyes flicking toward the nurse, and then back to William. And that brief exchange, that silent acknowledgement, did not go unnoticed, because it did not belong to routine or protocol. It belonged to something else, something unspoken yet clearly shared. And William took a slow breath, not out of stress but out of clarity, as if aligning his thoughts with what he already suspected, and he walked past the doctor toward the window, looking out over the city below, the steady movement of cars and distant lights continuing as if nothing had changed, as if the world beyond these walls remained untouched. And yet inside this room, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And Ava moved slightly closer to the table now, her eyes resting on the bottle again, her expression thoughtful rather than afraid, as if she was tracing back a memory. And she spoke softly, saying that the nurse had opened the cabinet twice that morning, even though she had already taken what she needed the first time, and that the second time she looked around before placing something inside. And that detail settled into the room with a quiet weight, not dramatic, not loud, but precise. And William turned back from the window, his gaze moving from Ava to the nurse, not accusing, not aggressive, simply observing. And the nurse's posture tightened just enough to confirm that the moment had reached her as well. And then the door opened gently as a member of the hospital's administrative team stepped in, holding a tablet connected to the internal system, explaining that the requested footage was ready to review. And the room seemed to draw in slightly, as if everything within it was preparing for what would come next. And William stepped forward again, his pace steady, his expression unchanged. But his presence now carried a different kind of authority, not just of wealth or position, but of someone who had already crossed the line from uncertainty into action. And as the tablet was positioned where all could see, the faint reflection of the room flickered across the screen before the footage began to load. And in that brief moment before the first frame appeared, no one spoke, no one moved, because whatever came next would not just answer a question, it would redefine everything that had been assumed until now. The screen flickered once before the footage stabilized, showing the quiet hallway outside the storage room in the early hours of the morning, the lighting dim, the environment still, and for a moment nothing seemed unusual, just an empty corridor stretching into silence. But William did not look away, his eyes fixed with the same patience that had carried him through countless negotiations. Because he understood that truth often appeared in the smallest movements. And then the timestamp shifted forward by a few seconds and the door to the storage room opened, revealing the nurse stepping inside with a calm, routine motion, her posture relaxed, her actions unremarkable at first glance. And Dr. Hayes spoke quietly beside him, pointing out that this was standard procedure, that nurses access supplies regularly throughout the night, that nothing about this moment indicated a problem. His voice steady, measured, almost rehearsed, but William did not respond. He simply watched as the footage continued, the nurse moving inside the room, partially visible through the open door, reaching toward the shelves, selecting items with familiarity, and for a few seconds everything aligned with expectation, until she paused, her hand hovering over a section of bottles, her head turning slightly toward the hallway as if checking for something or someone, and that pause stretched just long enough to break the rhythm of routine, just long enough to raise a question, and Ava, standing slightly behind William, leaned forward a fraction, her eyes narrowing with recognition, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. And then the nurse stepped fully out of view for a brief second before returning into frame, holding a small bottle that looked identical to the one now sitting on the bedside table, and she closed the cabinet. But instead of leaving, she hesitated again, her gaze shifting once more toward the hallway. And then she reached into her pocket, pulling out something small, something difficult to distinguish on the screen, and with a quick, practiced motion, she made a subtle exchange, placing one item inside the cabinet while slipping another into her pocket. The movement smooth, controlled, almost invisible unless someone was looking for it, and the room where they stood seemed to tighten instantly, not with noise but with awareness, because what had just happened was no longer open to interpretation. It was a clear deviation from routine, a moment that did not belong, and Dr. Hayes shifted slightly beside William, his breath measured, his silence now more noticeable than his earlier explanations, and William remained still, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpened, as if every piece of the situation was now falling into place, and the footage continued, showing the nurse closing the cabinet, adjusting her posture, and walking out into the hallway as if nothing had occurred, the door closing behind her with quiet finality. And as the video looped back to stillness, the room they stood in felt entirely different, no longer filled with uncertainty, but with a quiet, undeniable clarity. And William slowly turned his head, his gaze moving from the screen to the nurse standing across from him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm, deliberate recognition that what he had just seen could not be explained away. And Ava remained silent, her eyes steady, as if she had known from the beginning that this moment would arrive. And as the seconds passed without anyone speaking, the truth settled fully into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. And William Carter, who had spent his life identifying risk before it could grow, now understood that this was not a misunderstanding. It was something intentional, something carefully done, and most importantly, something that was not over yet. No one spoke immediately after the footage ended, and that silence carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it left no room for denial, only interpretation, and William did not rush to fill it. He simply let the moment settle, his eyes still on the screen as if replaying every second in his mind, confirming what he had already seen. And then he reached forward and paused the video at the exact frame where the nurse's hand moved between the cabinet and her pocket, freezing the motion that had shifted everything. And he studied it for another second before turning slowly to face her, his expression composed but now unmistakably focused, not on confrontation, but on understanding, because the action itself was clear, but the reason behind it was not, and that difference mattered. And the nurse, standing near the wall, held her posture, but her composure had changed, her shoulders slightly drawn in, her gaze no longer steady, and Dr. Hayes stepped forward as if to regain control of the situation, his voice calm, but firmer now as he began to explain that the footage could be misinterpreted, that there were procedures involving sample rotations and temporary storage, that what appeared unusual might have a legitimate explanation. But William raised his hand slightly, not in anger, but in quiet interruption, and the room fell still again, because this time, he was not listening for reassurance, he was directing the moment, and he asked the nurse a simple question. What did you take out and what did you put back? His tone even, without pressure, as if offering her a chance to define the narrative herself. And for a second, she did not answer, her eyes shifting briefly toward Dr. Hayes before returning to William, and that glance alone said more than words could, because it revealed a connection, a shared awareness that had not been acknowledged until now. And Ava watched closely from her position, her expression unchanged but attentive, as if she was measuring not just what was said, but what was avoided, and the nurse finally spoke, her voice controlled but softer than before, saying that she had been organizing inventory, that she noticed a bottle placed in the wrong section and corrected it, that the item in her pocket was a label tag she intended to replace later. Her explanation structured, careful, almost rehearsed, and William listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, but when she finished, he did not respond right away. He simply looked back at the paused frame on the screen, then at the bottle on the table, then back at her, connecting the details in silence. And then he asked another question, just as simple. Why was there no record of the change in the system? And this time, the pause that followed was longer, heavier, because it reached beyond explanation into accountability. And Dr. Hayes stepped in again, saying that minor adjustments did not always require immediate logging, that the system could be updated retroactively, that there was no violation of protocol, but his words no longer carried the same certainty, because the foundation beneath them had already shifted. And William took a slow breath, not out of frustration but out of clarity, as if the pattern he was seeing had now fully formed. And he moved back toward the table, picking up the bottle once more, turning it slightly in his hand, his eyes tracing the label, the number, the details Ava had pointed out earlier. And as he did, he spoke again, his voice quiet but final, saying that the bottle would be tested immediately, independently, without internal handling, and that until the results were confirmed, no further medication would be administered. And that decision landed with a quiet authority that could not be redirected. And as the room absorbed those words, Ava remained still, her gaze steady, as if she had been waiting not just for the truth to be seen, but for someone to act on it. And William Carter, now holding the small bottle that had started it all, understood that whatever had been set in motion was no longer hidden, and more importantly, it was no longer under someone else's control. The decision settled over the room like a quiet line that no one could step back across. And for a moment, no one challenged it. Not because they agreed, but because they understood that the control of the situation had shifted completely, and William set the bottle down with deliberate precision, as if marking it as evidence rather than medicine, his movements calm, his expression unchanged. But his presence now carried a different weight, one that did not invite negotiation, and Dr. Hayes adjusted his stance again, his composure returning in small, controlled pieces as he nodded slightly, saying that external testing could be arranged, that the hospital would cooperate fully, his tone measured, professional, but no longer leading, and the nurse remained still, her hands now clasped together in front of her, her gaze lowered for a brief moment before lifting again, as if recalibrating her role in a situation that had moved beyond her control. And Ava watched all of this without speaking, her eyes moving from one person to another, not with fear, but with a quiet awareness that the truth was only beginning to unfold. And William turned his attention back to her, studying her for a second longer than before, as if trying to understand how she had seen what others had missed. And then he asked her a simple question, "What made you look so closely?" And Ava hesitated just slightly, not because she was unsure, but because she was choosing her words carefully. And then she said that things that are supposed to stay the same should not change without a reason, and that she had learned to notice small differences because they usually meant something important had happened. And her answer did not sound like something a child would casually say. It sounded like a pattern, a way of seeing the world that had been shaped over time. And William nodded once, acknowledging not just her words, but the clarity behind them. And then his phone vibrated again, a new message appearing on the screen, and he glanced down briefly before looking back up, his expression sharpening just slightly as he processed what he had read. And he spoke without hesitation, informing the room that the sample had already been flagged for expedited analysis at an independent lab, that preliminary results could be available within hours, not days, and that until then, all related inventory would be isolated and reviewed. And that statement shifted the atmosphere again, because it meant that this was no longer an internal matter. It had extended beyond the walls of the hospital, into a process that could not be quietly adjusted or explained away. And Dr. Hayes responded with a slight nod, his lips pressed together for a moment before he spoke, agreeing that transparency was the priority, that the hospital's reputation depended on it, his words carefully chosen, but his tone carrying a subtle tension that had not been there before. And William did not challenge him, he simply observed, because at this point, the words themselves were less important than what would follow them, and Ava took a small step back, her gaze drifting once more to the bottle on the table, as if confirming that it was no longer in motion, no longer part of the routine that had hidden it before, and the room settled into a different kind of silence now, not one of uncertainty, but one of waiting, because the next answer would not come from observation or memory, it would come from verification. And as William stood there, his attention divided between the present moment and the results that were already on their way, he understood that whatever truth emerged next would not only explain what had happened, it would reveal who had intended it and why. Time moved forward, but the room did not relax. It held its shape as if everything inside it was suspended between what had been revealed and what was still hidden, and William remained near the table, no longer examining the bottle but aware of it, as if its presence alone continued to influence the space. And Dr. Hayes stepped slightly to the side, creating a small distance between himself and the nurse. A movement subtle enough to appear casual, yet clear enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. And William noticed, not reacting, simply storing the detail the same way he had stored every other inconsistency since the moment Ava spoke. And the administrative staff member quietly adjusted the tablet, placing it on a nearby counter as if the footage had already served its purpose, but the truth it revealed remained active in the room, impossible to set aside. And Ava shifted her weight slightly, her eyes now following the nurse more closely than before, as if she was trying to understand not just what had happened, but what might happen next. And William finally moved away from the table, walking slowly toward the center of the room, positioning himself where he could see everyone without turning, his posture relaxed but intentional, and he spoke again, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through the silence, asking the nurse to walk him through her entire shift from the beginning, every room she entered, every item she handled, every moment she could remember, not as an accusation, but as a reconstruction. And the nurse nodded, taking a small breath before she began, her voice steady at first as she described routine tasks, patient checks, inventory counts, everything aligning with standard procedure. But as she continued, the details became less precise, her pauses slightly longer, her phrasing more careful. And William listened without interruption, his expression neutral, his eyes steady, allowing the narrative to unfold on its own. And then he asked about the storage room specifically, not what she did, but why she returned a second time. And that question landed differently, because it removed the possibility of routine, focusing instead on intent. And the nurse hesitated, just long enough to acknowledge that the answer was not simple, and she said that she thought she had forgotten to check something, that she went back to confirm, but her voice lacked the certainty it held before. And Ava took a small step forward, her gaze fixed on the nurse as she spoke. And then she said quietly that the cabinet was already closed the first time, that there was nothing left open to check. And that detail did not challenge loudly, but it disrupted the explanation in a way that could not be ignored. And the nurse's eyes shifted again, this time more quickly, as if the consistency of her story had just been tested in real time. And Dr. Hayes stepped in once more, his tone calm but firmer, suggesting that memory could be unreliable under stress, that small details might be recalled differently, that it did not necessarily indicate wrongdoing. But William did not respond to the explanation. He simply looked at the nurse again, not with pressure, but with patience, giving her the space to either clarify or adjust. And that silence stretched, not empty, but full of expectation. And as the seconds passed, it became clear that the narrative being presented was no longer aligned with the evidence that had already been seen. And William did not need to point it out, because the room itself had already begun to recognize it. And Ava remained still, her presence quiet but constant, as if she was not just part of the moment, but the reason it had begun at all. And William Carter, standing at the center of it, understood that the truth was no longer something to discover, it was something to confirm, and that confirmation was getting closer with every passing second. The silence that followed did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt directional, as if every unanswered question was now pointing towards something specific, something that was beginning to take shape in ways that could not be reversed. And William remained exactly where he was, not moving, not interrupting, allowing the pressure of the moment to reveal what words alone could not. and the nurse stood there with her explanation still hanging in the air, but it no longer carried the same weight. Because it had already been measured against what was seen, against what was remembered, against what did not align. And Dr. Hayes shifted slightly again, his presence now more reactive than controlling, as if he was adjusting to a situation that was no longer within his command. And Ava watched quietly, her eyes moving between them with a calm attentiveness that felt far older than her age. And then William spoke again, his voice steady, not louder, but clearer, asking one more question, not about the action, not about the procedure, but about the sequence, asking the nurse to explain why the bottle that was placed into the cabinet did not match the one that was taken out. And that question landed with a precision that cut through everything else, because it was not open-ended, it was specific, rooted in evidence that had already been seen. And for a moment, the nurse did not respond, her lips parting slightly before closing again, her eyes shifting not toward the doctor this time, but toward the floor. And that shift said more than any explanation could, because it signaled a break in alignment, a moment where the narrative could no longer be maintained without contradiction. And Dr. Hayes stepped forward again, his tone more assertive now, suggesting that visual discrepancies on video could be misleading, that lighting, angle, and resolution could create the appearance of differences where none existed. But his words did not settle the room. They hovered, unanchored, because the confidence behind them had already weakened, and William did not challenge him directly. He simply walked back to the table and picked up the bottle again, holding it at eye level, turning it slowly under the light, comparing it not just to memory, but to logic, to consistency, to everything that should have remained stable but did not. And then he set it down once more, this time slightly apart from where it had been before, as if marking it as separate from the system it came from. And he looked at the nurse again, not with frustration, but with a calm finality, as if he had reached the point where explanation was no longer required. And then his phone vibrated again, a short, sharp interruption that carried immediate significance, and he glanced down, reading the message quickly. And for the first time since the moment Ava spoke, his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something had just changed. Something outside the room had confirmed what inside the room had suggested, and he looked up slowly, his gaze moving across each person in front of him. And when he spoke, his voice was still controlled, but now it carried a different kind of certainty, the kind that does not come from suspicion, but from evidence that has already been verified. And as that moment settled, Ava remained still, her presence quiet but central, as if everything that was now unfolding had begun with her single observation. And William Carter, standing there with the weight of confirmation in his hand, understood that the situation had just crossed a line that could not be undone, and whatever came next would not be about questioning what happened. It would be about revealing who made it happen and why. William did not rush to speak after reading the message. He let the weight of it settle first, allowing the silence to hold just long enough to shift the room from tension into realization. And then he lifted his gaze slowly, his eyes moving from the nurse to Dr. Hayes, not searching anymore, but confirming. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, precise, and impossible to misinterpret, saying that the preliminary analysis had identified a discrepancy in the chemical composition of the pills, that the contents did not fully match the prescribed formulation, and that while further testing would determine the exact variation, the difference was already enough to confirm that the medication had been altered. And those words did not echo loudly, but they landed with a quiet finality that changed everything, because they removed the last layer of uncertainty, leaving only accountability behind. And Dr. Hayes remained still for a moment, his expression tightening just slightly as if recalculating, his mind moving quickly through options that were no longer available, while the nurse's composure shifted more visibly now, her shoulders lowering, her posture no longer defensive but uncertain, as if the structure she had been relying on had quietly collapsed. And Ava watched without speaking, her eyes steady, not surprised, not relieved, simply present in a moment that had unfolded exactly as she expected. And William stepped forward again, closing the distance between himself and the others just enough to make his presence unavoidable. And he asked one more question, not about what had happened, because that was already established, but about why, his tone still even, still controlled. but now carrying a clarity that demanded an answer, and for a moment, no one responded, because the question had shifted the focus entirely, moving beyond action into intent, beyond process into purpose. And Dr. Hayes finally spoke, his voice measured, choosing each word carefully, suggesting that there could be an explanation involving supply chain irregularities, that contamination could occur outside the facility, that the situation might not be as direct as it appeared. But even as he spoke, the structure of his explanation lacked the certainty it once held, because it no longer aligned with the sequence of events that had already been observed. And William listened without interruption, his expression unchanged. But when the doctor finished, he did not acknowledge the explanation. He simply looked at the nurse again, his gaze steady, patient, allowing the silence to return, not as pressure, but as space. And that space became more difficult to hold, because it no longer protected anything. It only exposed what remained unsaid. And the nurse took a small breath, her eyes lowering briefly before lifting again, as if deciding whether to continue maintaining the narrative or step outside of it. And that decision lingered in the air, unfinished, as the room remained still, every person aware that the next words would not just explain the situation, they would define it. And William Carter, standing there with confirmation already in hand, understood that the truth had reached its final threshold, and whatever came next would not be about discovering what happened. It would be about revealing who chose to make it happen and what they believed they would gain from it. The silence did not break immediately. It deepened, as if the room itself was waiting for a truth that had already been cornered but not yet spoken. And William did not move. He did not repeat the question. He simply held his position, his gaze steady on the nurse, allowing the weight of confirmed evidence to do what pressure no longer needed to. And Dr. Hayes stood just to the side, his posture rigid now, his earlier composure replaced with a careful stillness, as if any movement might reveal more than intended. And Ava remained quiet, her presence unchanged, but her eyes stayed fixed on the nurse, as if she understood that this was the moment where observation would turn into admission. And after a long second, the nurse finally exhaled, a small, controlled release that seemed to carry more meaning than any explanation she had given before. And when she spoke, her voice was softer, no longer structured around defense, but around something closer to truth. And she said that she did not create the change, that she only followed instructions, that she was told to switch the bottle, not to ask questions, not to log the action, just to make it look consistent. And her words settled into the room with a quiet clarity, because they did not try to deny what had been seen. They simply shifted the responsibility, and William listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpened slightly, because the direction of the situation had just moved from action to hierarchy, from what happened to who ordered it. And he asked the next question without hesitation: who gave the instruction? And this time, the pause that followed was different, not uncertain, but reluctant, as if the answer carried consequences that extended far beyond the room. And the nurse's eyes moved again, not toward the door, not toward the floor, but toward Dr. Hayes, just for a second, just enough to confirm what words had not yet said. And that single glance shifted everything, because it aligned with the pattern that had been forming since the beginning. And Dr. Hayes reacted instantly, stepping forward, his voice controlled but sharper now, stating that assumptions should not be made, that correlation did not equal causation, that the situation required careful review before conclusions were drawn. But his words no longer held authority. They sounded like containment, like an attempt to slow something that had already gained momentum. And William did not respond to the statement. He simply observed the exchange, the timing, the reaction, the alignment. And then he turned his attention back to the nurse, not with pressure, but with patience, giving her the space to either confirm or retreat. And that space held for a moment longer before she spoke again, her voice quieter, but clearer, saying that the instructions came through a verbal request, not written, not logged, delivered in a way that avoided record, and that she was told it was necessary for the patient's treatment plan, that it was temporary, that it would be corrected later. And as she finished, the room settled into a different kind of stillness, one that no longer questioned what had happened, but fully recognized the structure behind it. And Ava remained still, her gaze steady, as if she had just witnessed the final piece fall into place, and William Carter, standing in the center of it all, understood that the truth had moved beyond possibility into confirmation, and that what began as a small difference in a label had now revealed a decision, a choice made by someone who believed it would remain unseen, and that belief was no longer holding. The moment the nurse finished speaking, the room did not erupt or react loudly. Instead, it settled into a stillness so complete that every person inside it understood the line had been crossed, not just in action, but in intent, and William did not raise his voice, did not step forward in confrontation. He simply shifted his gaze to Dr. Hayes, holding it there with a calm, unwavering focus that carried more weight than any accusation. And for the first time since the situation began, the doctor did not immediately respond, his posture remaining upright, but the precision in his composure beginning to fracture at the edges, his silence no longer controlled but measured, as if calculating what could still be said and what no longer could. And William spoke again, his tone even, almost quiet, asking a single question, whether the instruction was given as part of a treatment decision or something else entirely. And the question did not demand an answer. It framed the reality that had already been exposed, and Dr. Hayes finally exhaled, a subtle shift that marked the moment where resistance gave way to recognition, and he said that the adjustment was made with intention, that the formulation was slightly altered to observe response patterns, that it was controlled, monitored, and never meant to cause harm. His words structured carefully, presenting the action as calculated rather than reckless, but the explanation did not restore authority, it only clarified the decision. And William listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharpening with each word, because the explanation did not address consent, it did not address transparency, it only reframed the action in terms of purpose, and that distinction mattered. And Ava stood quietly near the table, her gaze moving from the doctor to the bottle and back again, as if she was connecting the words being spoken now to the moment she first noticed something was wrong. And William took a slow breath, not out of tension, but out of clarity, and he asked one more question, not about the process, but about the authority behind it, asking who approved the decision to alter the medication without documentation. And this time, the pause that followed was not uncertain, it was final, because the answer could not be redirected, and Dr. Hayes responded with a measured tone, stating that the decision was made internally, that he believed it was within his professional judgment, that the outcome justified the method. And as those words settled into the room, they did not create noise. They created definition, because they confirmed that what had happened was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate choice made under the assumption that it would remain unchallenged. And William remained still for a moment, allowing that clarity to fully form. And then he stepped back slightly, creating just enough distance to signal that the situation had moved beyond discussion, and he spoke with quiet finality, stating that the findings, the footage, and the statements would be documented and forwarded for formal review, that external oversight would determine the next steps, and that until then, all involvement in his care would be reassigned immediately. And those words did not carry anger, they carried resolution, the kind that does not need emphasis to be understood. And as the room absorbed that decision, Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, but her role now undeniable, because without her, none of this would have surfaced. And William Carter, standing there with the full weight of the truth now visible, understood that what had been hidden behind routine and authority had just been brought into the open, and there would be no returning it to where it was before. The room did not return to what it had been. It settled into something quieter, more defined, as if every word that had been spoken had reshaped the space itself. And William stood there for a moment longer, not to assert control, but to acknowledge the finality of what had just unfolded, his gaze moving once more across the room, not searching now, not questioning, simply recognizing the roles each person had played in bringing the truth to the surface. And then his attention returned to Ava, who remained near the table, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the outcome had aligned exactly with what she expected from the moment she spoke. And William walked toward her slowly, his presence no longer carrying tension, but something steadier, something grounded. And when he stopped a few feet away, He looked at her with a level of focus that was no longer analytical, but personal. And he said quietly that she noticed what others did not, that she spoke when it would have been easier to stay silent, and that because of that, everything in this room had changed, and Ava did not respond immediately. She simply held his gaze, and then she gave a small nod, not as recognition of praise, but as acknowledgement of a simple truth, that something was wrong and she chose to say it. And that was enough. And William allowed a brief pause before speaking again, his voice still even, but carrying a different weight now, saying that there are moments when small details matter. More than anything else, moments when the difference between noticing and ignoring becomes the difference between outcomes, and that those moments are often overlooked until someone decides they are not. And as he spoke, the rest of the room remained still, not interrupting, not redirecting, because the situation had already moved beyond them, into something that would continue outside these walls, through reviews, through decisions, through consequences that would follow their own course. And William turned slightly, his attention shifting toward the door, where the administrative staff member still stood, waiting quietly. And he gave a simple instruction to proceed with the documentation and transfer of records, his tone calm, his decision already made. And then he looked back at Ava one more time, his expression softer now, not in weakness, but in clarity, and he asked her how she knew to look so closely, and Ava considered the question for a second before answering, her voice quiet but certain, saying that when things are supposed to help people, they should not feel wrong, and if they do, it usually means something needs to be seen, and her answer did not sound like theory, it sounded like experience, like a pattern she had learned to trust. And William nodded once, understanding that the answer did not need to be more complicated than that. And as the moment settled, the room remained unchanged, but the meaning within it had shifted completely, because what had once been routine was now examined, what had once been trusted was now verified, and what had once been hidden was now visible. And as William Carter stood there, no longer as a patient within a system, but as someone who had seen beyond it, he understood that the most important change had already happened, not in the records, not in the decisions that would follow, but in the moment someone chose to speak, and everything after that simply made it real.